Hi there, Kendra Tolbert here. I'm a registered dietitian and yoga teacher, and I specialize in women's health and fertility. And I'm super delighted to have an opportunity to share this interview with you. So, I just interviewed Darcie Black, and Darcie is a fertility awareness educator, a holistic reproductive health practitioner, an herbalist, and a doula. So, she is quite knowledgeable about bodies and health and reproductive health. I know that you are going to learn so much from this interview, so we're going to dive right into it. Good. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to talk to you kind of sort of face to face. I've read so many of your notes because I used to be a Maven provider and I was always so impressed by just the quality of care that you put into your notes. I was like, oh, she has to be even more amazing in person. So, anyhow, enough about like gushing over you. I'd love it if you would introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And yes, I really appreciated being able to work with you, work via you, through you with other clients. So, yeah, um, all about holistic support. So, my name is Darcie Black. I am a holistic reproductive health practitioner and certified fertility awareness educator. I wear other hats in my life, but those are the areas that we know each other through.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, cool. We might get a chance to tap onto some of the other things that you do. We'll see. We'll see. So, you said that you do fertility awareness education. I didn't say that exactly right. So, maybe you can restate it and share exactly what that is.
You said it perfectly. That's it. Yeah, fertility awareness educator. So, as a FAE, I help people to understand how their reproductive systems work, how they have the ability to assess their body's only expressions of fertility. And as female body folks, our fertility ebbs and flows from one phase of the cycle to the next, from day to day. And so, because of that variation, because it's not consistent, we do have ways to identify that. And there's a lot that we can understand about our hormonal function, our entire, the way that it is connected to our body. The menstrual cycle is considered a vital sign. It is a way for us to understand whole body health. So, as a fertility awareness educator, I teach a standardized fertility awareness method called the Justice method.
Ah, and there's a lot of different types of methods. I feel like I hear people say fertility awareness based methods and or just fertility awareness as if it's just one thing, as opposed to a lot of different categories and methods within those categories. So could you break down the categories and then some of the methods that are in each of those categories?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing to note is that a fertility awareness based method is not the rhythm method. It's not the calendar method. So, it is actually taking daily data from your body and interpreting what that means. So, for those who don't know, a calendar method is saying, okay, I have a cycle, and this is when it's used, it's meant to be used when someone has a very consistent cycle. And so they say, based on the history that my body has done this one thing over and over again, we're going to assume it's going to continue doing that one thing. And we are going to assume that we know exactly when it's going to do that thing that's really important, like when we're fertile and when we're ovulating. And that's based on calculation of days. But our bodies are not robots. We don't do exactly the same thing every day, every cycle. So, you know, that method is not super effective. So, a fertility awareness based method, it is kind of the umbrella term for many different types of methods. Folks may have heard about natural family planning, NFP. That is a use of a fertility awareness method through the lens of usually it's like through a religious sect, right? So it is approaching the fertile window either with strategic abstinence or with strategic intercourse, right? Whereas there are other types of fertility awareness based methods that are not taught through the religious lens. And it is, there are mucus only methods. So taking a step back for just a moment here, our cervix, which is the bottom of the uterus, um, produces a fluid when our estrogen levels are rising, when our bodies are maturing egg cells. And that gives us kind of a heads up that our body is working towards ovulation, that we are actively fertile. So, mucus only methods assess the presence of cervical fluid every day. And at the end of every day, they can determine whether or not that day is a fertile day. There are symptothermal methods, which is combining symptoms like that presence of cervical mucus, maybe assessing cervical position because that can change subtly throughout the hormonal expression in the body, with the combination of our daily waking basal body temperature. So the thermal piece is what is our daily temperature, and that temperature, our core temperature, shifts after we have ovulated. So symptothermal is combining information from our body to give us the heads up that we're about to be fertile. And then the thermal piece confirms and says, yep, we already did that deed. All good here. And then there's symptohormonal methods, which will combine those symptoms of cervical fluid, cervical position, perhaps, with the assessment, usually of urinary hormones. Sometimes it's saliva, but urinary hormones of luteinizing hormone, which is a hormone that surges and releases kind of just prior to ovulation happening. And that can be combined. I think that generally speaking, it is a luteinizing hormone based kind of prediction around ovulation, but technically a symptohormonal method can be combined with retrospective hormonal data, showing the progesterone hormone rising after ovulation has happened. So those are all of the various kind of big overview of kind of what the different methods look like.
Oh, thank you for breaking that down because there's, I think, a lot of confusion because there are so many different methods, and because some people do think that it's the rhythm method. And even just, I think, going back to the idea that some people aren't sure what a menstrual cycle is, right? I often have people say, I'm on my menstrual cycle. And I'm like, why, yes. But I think what they mean is they're menstruating or they're on their period. But I think we often just say, like, we're on our cycle.
Mhm.
That's not quite
Yeah.
accurate. Break that down for me, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Agreed. And this is like no shame at all, right? We're not taught this stuff. We don't get
No.
to learn this at an age in which it like becomes embedded within us as we're learning these new expressions in our bodies. So, um, all the time when I ask someone, so tell me a little bit about your cycle length, they'll tell me about their period, right? And I'm like, oh, the whole cycle, the whole time. So the menstrual cycle is divided into 4 phases. The phase that is the most obvious phase is when we have our period. So we consider the first day of the cycle the first day of the period. Even though when you actually look at all of the events in the menstrual cycle, it doesn't really make sense that we say the period is the first day of the cycle, just based on what's happening, but it's the most obvious. It's a clear, we were not bleeding and now we are bleeding. So the menstrual phase is the phase where the lining of the uterus is releasing from the body and we're having our period. That is, kind of quickly followed by a phase referred to as the follicular phase. So the follicles, which are the little sacs that surround the egg cells as they're growing and maturing, the follicles are stimulated to grow and help those egg cells mature and get ready for ovulation. And so the follicular phase is that time frame between when we have our period and prior to ovulation. So when the egg cells are growing. That's the phase of the cycle that varies the most from one person to the next, from one cycle to the next. It can be influenced by stressors and illness and lots of different factors. Um, the third phase of the cycle is ovulation. And technically, ovulation is like a moment in time. It's just like bloop when that egg pops out of the ovary. But it is such an integral piece of the whole puzzle. It's like the linchpin moment, hormonally speaking. So even though it's like just a moment in time, it is like the end all be all in many ways of what the body is doing. Um, and then that's followed by the fourth phase of the cycle is the luteal phase. And that's in reference to the development of this gland that kind of comes from the follicle, it turns into the corpus luteum. So the luteal phase is that development of that gland where it's initially producing high levels of progesterone and estrogen, and then it wanes over time. And that stays pretty standardized. So when someone is tracking their cycle, they are able to confirm and identify ovulation, they'll be able to calculate their average luteal phase length, which doesn't really shift very dramatically, maybe by a day or so in either direction, but not too much. And so that is determined by the health of the corpus luteum.
Lovely. I'm over here totally nerding out. Like, I love learning about this stuff. And it honestly doesn't matter how many times I've heard it. I'm still like, tell me again.
Yeah.
Because it's amazing. I was
Yeah.
in awe of my body when I learned more about fertility awareness. I was like, no, this is magic right here. But anyhow, so you actually cleared up, I think, a really common misconception about the menstrual cycle. Are there any other misconceptions that you'd like to clear up, either about the menstrual cycle or just fertility awareness in general?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think it's really easy. I kind of spoke to this previously, but I think it's really easy to assume that our bodies do the same thing all of the time. And it really is important, just like any relationship that you have, in your life, to be engaged, right? And to listen and to not make assumptions and to not be like, oh, yeah, that does that thing all the time. I know how that relationship works, right? Um, those don't tend to work out so well, those relationships, right? But when we are actually present, with that other being, our cycle, our bodies, we can get a lot of information. And so I think a little bit of a misconception is that, the cycle is 28 days, right? That that's what a regular cycle is. And that if someone's cycle is sometimes 25 days, sometimes 33 days, that there's some wild irregularity there, but that's technically normal. It's totally normal for it to vary by, a handful of days, anything less than 10 days. So that's one misconception, which I think can sometimes get us into trouble when we're talking about, contraception and things like that. Um, and and then I would say that, and this is maybe not specifically about fertility awareness, but one of the things that I love about learning this skill and learning how to interpret the language of your body is that you have the awareness to determine when something is abnormal, when something has changed. And there often is an intuition, an awareness, like whether it's an actual data point or it's like, just something seems off. Um, and it's very common for us to look outside of ourselves for answers, to go to a practitioner and say, what do I do? What are my options? What's wrong here? And what I love about using a fertility awareness method, and especially when that becomes, a practice and you have a lot of, history with yourself and with your cycle, you are able to get that answer yourself and understand, like, I do know what phase of the cycle something's happening, or I do know that I'm not ovulating, or my bleeding is actually quite heavy and it used to be a normal range but now it's quite heavy or it's quite light. And so rather than, I think it can help us to um yeah, to just look within ourselves and look within, the information that our body gives us, and not always take that power out of ourselves and give it to someone else, when it comes to our care.
You are speaking my language. I am all about body autonomy. I am all about body literacy. So it's really delightful to hear someone else talk about it in this way. And as you were speaking about it, maybe because of the work that I do, I almost saw fertility awareness as like a mindfulness based practice. It really is an opportunity to like tune in and be with what is in the moment versus what was in the past or what you're hoping will be in the future. You only have today's information to determine what's happening today. And I love hearing that.
Yeah, and it's such a practice. Well, one, the charts don't lie. Like, there's a lot about and this is a very generalized statement that I'm about to make, but I think that especially as women, we can take on a lot, hold hold quite a burden, and just keep on doggy paddling, right? And we're like, we're fine, we got this, we're fine. Um, and so we can convince ourselves, we can easily convince others that we're fine, but the chart will tell you otherwise if your body is really experiencing chronic stress. So there's like when it comes to the mindfulness piece, like it's also being able to receive that information, sit with that information that you're getting from your body. When you see something that's technically considered like outside the range of normal, how do we how do we look at that information with compassion rather than judgment and name calling that cycle or our bodies or anything? And so yeah, absolutely a mindfulness practice.
Oh, I love that. I love that compassion and curiosity. And this is an opportunity to practice it with yourself in real time. I love that. I
Yeah.
love that. So I'd love to backtrack a little bit because we talked about the rhythm method. And I feel like the rhythm method is why sometimes fertility awareness based methods get a bad rap in terms of how effective they are in preventing pregnancy. So, can you tease those two apart and share what the effectiveness rates are around actual fertility awareness based methods?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, I think one thing to have an awareness of is that when we're talking about effectiveness rates, there is the difference between learning a method and practicing it with perfect use, right? So following the rules of that particular method. And then there is, I think it's kind of common for it to be kind of I'm picking and choosing. I'm taking it from this method and I'm doing that from that method. And there are different types of methods, and those methods have rules. And when you follow those rules, then you can actually lean on that, what the data is showing in regards to effectiveness rates. But if we are not following a particular method and we're picking and choosing, then we can't lean on those effectiveness rates. So there's that piece. um, the calendar method, the rhythm method, it's a method. It exists. It has, there are effectiveness rates there. It is meant for folks who have really consistent cycles that do the same thing over and over again, right? And they land within this like 25 to 35-day window. Um, and even that, even when you have a very consistent cycle and you're using a calendar kind of calculation, with perfect use, it actually is it's kind of similar. This is going to sound wild. It's kind of similar to the effectiveness rate of some of the hormonal birth control pills. So it's like
No.
it hangs out in like the 90-ish when it's done perfectly, right? And that's when you use the hormonal birth control pill perfectly, that has a higher rate. But like the typical rate of hormonal birth control is around that 90%. Um, when it's done, in typical fashion, right? So maybe not exactly perfect every single time, then we're looking at, way more of like 75 to 85% likelihood, right? So a lot of people, uh, poo poo that method. Valid, right? Like when we're looking at the typical rates, it's like, okay, yeah, maybe that's if you're really on the no baby train, not really helpful. Um, with these other methods, the mucus only methods, the symptothermal method, the symptohormonal methods, um, again, using a particular method, following it, when you work with a fertility awareness educator, an educator trained in that particular method, you will have the opportunity to use that method perfectly. And I think that that's a big differentiation as well. With each of these different types of methods, so like the mucus only methods like the Creighton method or the Billings ovulation method, their typical use rates are or their perfect rates, I think, are closer to the like 97 to 99 plus effectiveness rates. Their typical use rates are more in that like 85 to 95-ish kind of place. Um, Symptothermal methods, so mucus and temperature, the perfect use over 99%, 99.5, 99.67%. When you're looking at typical rates, it's generally more around, and it depends on the type, but more in that like high 97s to high 98 range. So, that's pretty impressive. The symptohormonal methods, they're perfect use is actually a little bit lower. And what I mentioned previously in regards to, um, you know, confirming ovulation, right? And so with often the symptohormonal methods are taking two data points that are giving us, signals that our body is leaning towards fertility. There's often a calculation method like kind of integrated into this. So it's not just do I see the presence of that hormone rising, but when do I start testing for that? When do I consider myself, in that fertile time? It's based on data from previous cycles. And so you actually have to have several cycles worth of data before you can implement that calculation piece to it. And so again, all the reasons to be working with instructors here. But the perfect use for that is actually a little bit lower. It kind of hangs out more in that like 95 to high 97%, and typical use is closer to that like 90%, effectiveness rate. So it varies. Effectiveness rates vary, and working with an instructor is really important so that you have the opportunity to actually use it perfectly. And then everyone's cycles are different, everyone's bodies and lifestyles are different. So one method may serve one person more than another person. And so it's helpful to look through all the different methods. And then one other piece that I think is really important, and maybe this goes into the conversation around misconceptions. When someone is using what we call BAFTing, barriers at fertile times. So someone identifies, I'm fertile today, I'm not trying to conceive, I'm going to use a barrier method like a condom. You are no longer using the fertility awareness method as your contraceptive method, you're using the barrier. So you have to lean on those statistics of perfect use, typical use of that barrier method. And it doesn't have to be condoms. It could be a cervical cap and spermicide and all different ways to prevent sperm and cervix touching. But that's, I think, another thing to have an awareness of is, are you using this method for contraception, or are you using this method to inform other contraceptive methods you might be using?
Again, nerding out over here. I'm like, yay, numbers.
Yeah.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much for breaking all of that down. And I really appreciate that you talked about typical use versus perfect use, right? Because I'm a pretty typical person.
Yep.
I can't completely lean on the idea of perfection. And the fact that you talked about, you said bafting, right? I've heard of
Yeah.
it, never
I
heard the
love that
term
term.
before. But yeah, someone else had mentioned that, like, at the point in which you are having sex during your fertile window, if you're using another method, then it's that method that is now serving as your contraception. So you have to look to those numbers to determine if you're actually, or how likely you are to get pregnant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, so when we're looking at those perfect use and typical use, like that is abstaining during the fertile time frame.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So I think most of the people who are watching this are folks who are trying to conceive. So, or maybe not. Maybe they're trying to conceive down the road. So they're actually super interested in what you just shared as well. But I think a larger part of the audience is like, okay, now tell me how to use this to know when I can get pregnant. Break that down for us.
Yeah. Um, and this is a space in this work that I love being in. And I think that there is also a lot of misconception in regards to our fertility and likelihoods of conceiving and how do we actually go about this. And I think that part of that has to do with, again, lack of education. We're often just kind of, we spend a good portion, for a lot of people, not everyone, a good portion of our lives, using a hormonal birth control to prevent pregnancy. And so when we come off of birth control and we are ready to start trying to conceive, it can feel like a little bit of a whiplash when we recognize that it's not just any day that you can conceive. Um, and so the most important piece, well, maybe I'll take that back. There's two things that are really important when it comes to using this method and preparing to try to conceive. One piece is building that strong foundation. So, assessing your cycle parameters and really determining, is there anything that your body and your cycle is telling you that's informing you that it needs a little bit of help? So, if you have the ability to assess the various cycle parameters, so that's things like how frequently do you get a period, how many days are you bleeding for, roughly how much are you bleeding, um, how long is it between your period and when you start to see signs of fertility, how many days are you seeing that cervical mucus for, can you confirm ovulation, and if you can, how many days between ovulation and your next periods, or there are these different kind of expected parameters and ranges of normal. And if you can look at that, for a few cycles, I like to assess patterns. So maybe 3 cycles or more, and everything is kind of plinkoing into those expected ranges. Okay, now we can actually work towards, preparing to try to conceive or work towards, conceiving. And once we are in that space and we know that things are solid and the body is saying, yep, I got this, then the most important piece is identifying cervical mucus. So um, the vagina is most days of the month acidic. And that's important because it's an opening to the inside of the body. So we want that protection there. But sperm cells can't live in the vagina when it's acidic. So um, sperm cells need a more alkaline environment. And cervical fluid, so this mucousy fluid that's produced at the bottom of the uterus, at the cervix, in response to estrogen levels rising, as those egg cells are growing and maturing, that fluid is more alkaline. And so it like slightly temporarily shifts the pH of the vagina. So sperm cells have even a chance of living. The cervical fluid, when you look at it under a microscope, there are different types of cervical fluid. And when you look at the estrogenic fluid, it basically creates these little swimming lanes, like these little hallways that are just like so it helps to actively transport sperm cells into the reproductive system, secretes little sugars and proteins to keep them alive. So if you've ever heard the like either don't worry, sperm live for 3 to 5 days, or guess what, sperm live for 3 to 5 days. That's only if that cervical mucus is present. Um, there's different types of cervical mucus. Some of the cervical mucus will filter out abnormally shaped sperm. I mean, there's all different types of mucus, but all you need to know is when you go to the bathroom, if you just add in an extra wipe with toilet paper, I mean, if you can remember before you sit down, just wipe, see if something's there, go to the bathroom, wipe as normal, do a secondary pass through. I mean, you're already sitting there, you're already wiping anyway. So just start checking your toilet paper. If there's cervical mucus being produced, it will at some point during the day come down onto the toilet paper. So if you consistently, every time you go to the bathroom, look for that fluid, once you start seeing it, that's your body telling you, like, doors are open, sperm cells can live here today, actively fertile. And so it's most important to time intercourse with the days that you're seeing cervical fluid, and less important to time it with the day before ovulation, the day of ovulation, right? I think that luteinizing hormone and ovulation predictor kits can be a really helpful tool for some people and in some scenarios. But that tool, that test, is just telling us that there's a particular hormone that has risen today. That is telling us it's working towards ovulation. And ovulation statistically is probably going to happen pretty soon. but it doesn't tell us if the sperm can get into the uterus. So for some people's bodies, their body makes that fluid for 3 or 4 days, goes away for a day or two. We get that LH surge. And if you're just focusing on the ovulation tests, you've missed the boat of where the sperm cells can actually get in. And so um, oftentimes they overlap and all the things are happening at the same time. And that's very simple and straightforward. But it's not true for everyone's body. So that I would say when someone is actively trying to conceive, assessing their cycle parameters, making sure that there's no signs that they need more support, and then timing intercourse with the days of cervical fluid and then letting it be. And that is, and then the likelihood of conceiving, I mean, it varies at different times in our lives, but it's actually pretty low. Like, even if we time everything perfectly, with the cervical fluid and, you know, one like both bodies are really kind of in optimal health, the range of kind of what we can expect is like anywhere from like maybe 10 to 20% likelihood that it's going to work each cycle. So it's so okay if you're on month 3 of trying to conceive and it hasn't happened yet. Like, totally normal.
Thank you for sharing every bit of that. There was so much good information in there. I really, really appreciated what you shared about the LH strips and the OPKs, and what's going on with your cervical fluid. It, I have probably been a little too outspoken against, not against OPKs, but definitely encouraging people to trust the signs that they're getting from their bodies more than this single bit of information that they get from a strip. And I think that has more to do with my own ideas about external authority and all that stuff. But anyway, talk about that a different day. But I appreciate that you mentioned there can be overlap, but there's also this other sign that your body is giving you for free
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. So, I mean, you've already given us so much information, which I have thoroughly appreciated. I'm wondering if there's anything else that you hope that people would walk away with, or maybe there was something that you said already that you want to make sure that you really drive home.
Well, I guess I would say that like it's never too late to learn this method, right? And to learn this information from your body. I think that it's a conversation I have with people every day where they're like, "How come nobody taught me this? How come I didn't know this sooner?" And I could go on and on about why that might be. But um, a fertility using a fertility awareness method is super helpful when we are trying to conceive, when we are actively not trying to conceive. But regardless of where you are in that version of your life, um, using a fertility awareness method allows you to really get this like intimate information from your system that is really telling you kind of finger on the pulse of how's your overall health, and it is something that I think everyone who cycles and bleeds can really benefit from. And even, and I think in some ways, especially when we are shifting into this phase of our reproductive lives of perimenopause, and all of a sudden we're going through really big changes again. It's kind of like our second puberty. Um, Tracking your cycle and assessing those cycle parameters can really help you to then have some information to work with a practitioner to create, a strategy around it to help you live your best life and to feel comfortable in your body and healthy and vital. And so I would say it's never too late to learn this method. And yeah, stay curious. It's a really, I mean, like you said, it's magic. It really is like we hold this ability to know so much about ourselves and to make informed decisions about our day-to-day lives. I mean, we didn't even talk about the concept of like living in sync with your cycle and like the different energetics and the phases of the cycle, right? And so there's just such juicy magic in, really understanding your cycle. So it's worth it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know that people are going to want to learn more about you and learn more from you. So, where can they do that?
Yeah, they're welcome to hang out on my website, darcieblack.com. They can follow me on Instagram, which is my name. It's underscore Darcie Black underscore. There are already Darcie Blacks out there. But yeah, so feel free to connect with me via my website, via socials. And yeah, would love to talk about cycles all the time. This is what I do every day, all the time.
Lovely. I will make sure to link to everything in the description box below. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.